Welcome everyone to this town hall. We greatly appreciate it, and we're going to get started right now.
Great. Hi, I'm Jan Bach-Steffensmeyer. I'm at Ohio State University and currently serving as the American Political Science Association's president. I'm excited to be partnering with Professor Franklin, who's serving as a president of this distinguished group that he's brought together here. And I'm excited to be here this afternoon for this panel. I want to offer my gratitude to the people who've worked on this town hall. Kalila Brown Dean at Quinnipiac University, whose Disrupted podcast started yesterday. It was wonderful. It premiered yesterday, so also check that out on Connecticut Public Radio. Also want to thank Pearl Ford Dow at Emory University, Kim Mealy, APSA Senior Director for Diversity and Inclusion Programs, Wendy Smooth at Ohio State University, Cherie Wallace at the University of Louisville, and Tiffany Willoughby Harold at the University of California, Irvine, who all helped put this together, and graphic designers Alexis Harris and Karima Scott and Jasmine Scott. I want to talk just briefly about a couple things that are going on at the American Political Science Association. First, the 2020 meeting call is out. And we also have a task force and resulting edited volume that will go together that's focusing on promoting pluralism. The co-chairs of that are Valeria Sinclair Chapman and Dino Christensen. And in that call, if you will see it on APSA's website, promoting pluralism starts with recognizing that we're in the midst of political, economic, and social upheaval that portends significant transformations across the globe. The answers to what the global shifts mean for governments, nations, communities, and individuals are not straightforward or obvious, and the tools necessary to examine them are varied and expansive. Importantly, we recognize that the diversity of our scholars in terms of racial and ethnic background, nationality, gender, sexuality, and gender expression all contribute to the knowledge and ways of understanding the world, and thus the theme is pluralism and promoting pluralism. I also urge you to get involved with the very active American Political Science Association's Task Force on Election Assistance. That is co-chaired by David Lublin and Leanne Banaszak that you can reach out to, but I also want to draw your attention to the subcommittee chaired by Darren Davis on drawing attention to racial disparities and disenfranchisement. So without further ado, I'll turn it back to President Franklin.
Greetings, hope you're doing well. Let me make sure I got this together right here. Greetings. My name is Sekou Franklin, and I'm the president of the National Conference of Black Political Scientists. And as an NCOBPS tradition, I want to recognize our ancestors, our elders, and those who have lost loved ones due to COVID-19 and police violence. The National Conference of Black Political Scientists, also known as NCOBPS, is happy to partner with the American Political Science Association, also known as APSA. And I want to give special thanks to President Janet Bach-Steffensmeyer, Kim Mealy, Jasmine Scott, and Karima Scott for assisting in this effort. And I also want to give recognition to Alexis Harris, a Clark Atlanta University graduate who did our graphic design. I want to give special thanks to our organizing committee for putting on this very important town hall, and it is spearheaded by this organizing committee. Kalila Brown Dean, Pearl Ford Dow, Tiffany Willoughby Harold, who is also the vice president of NCOBPS. And I want to give special thanks to Cherie Wallace and Wendy Smooth, both of whom went beyond the call of duty in spearheading this town hall, and really the initial conversations that led to today's dialogue. And Dr. Wendy Smooth pulled together a group of 40 African-American women to begin talking about election and the 2020 election cycle. And this is how the dialogue emerged. Finally, I want to acknowledge my executive council members who are in the audience, and any past presidents viewing this town hall. We have two past presidents that are involved in this event, Todd Shaw, who's a panelist, and Wendy Smooth. Since NCOBPS was founded in 1969, we have been at the forefront of synthesizing research, mentorship, and activism. And doing this while uniting faculty and students from historically Black colleges and universities, and non-HBCUs, or what some may refer to as mainstream universities. Many of our members produce outstanding research, but also work on the front lines of liberation struggles, resistance movements, criminal justice reform, electoral justice, police accountability, voting rights, transnational politics, and Pan-Africanism, and many are advancing important policy interventions. Some refer to this as scholar activism, others refer to this as quote unquote engaged scholarship. But I think the best way to describe this approach is to assert that NCOBPS has always walked in alignment and hand in glove with communities of struggle, who, to reference theologian Howard Thurman, stand with their backs against the wall. And this is the space in which I believe this town hall emerges. Scholars who are making the connections between their research and the daily struggles of everyday people and everyday Black people whose life circumstances will be impacted by the outcome of the 2020 election. And without a doubt, this is a critical moment in the nation's history, and racial justice, as much as anything, is on the ballot. In addition to the presidential and congressional elections, the outcome will determine thousands of rules and regulations by the federal, administered by the federal agencies. The outcome of this election will determine judgeships, U.S. attorneys, and state legislative races, which will determine the next round of redistricting. All of these issues intersect with race and justice and life outcomes of the most disaffected groups in the United States. So I want to thank you today for joining this town hall. I want to thank our moderators, our panelists, and our audience for joining this discussion, and encourage everyone not just to get out and vote, but to center electoral justice at the center of this election. And finally, please go to our website, www.ncopes.org. Also, submit a paper to our annual conference. It'll be a virtual conference in March. I have your email, so I'll email everyone a reminder of this. Next, I'll introduce our Vice President, Tiffany Willoughby-Herrard.
Thank you so much, Dr. Franklin. My task, along with that of Wendy Smooth, a professor at The Ohio State University, is to introduce our esteemed panelists. I'll begin with Dr. Pearl K. Ford Dowd, who is the Asa Griggs Candler Professor of Political Science and African American Studies at Emory University. Dow's most recent research focuses on African American women's political ambition and public leadership. Her published writing includes co-authorship of Remaking the Democratic Party, Lyndon B. Johnson as Native Son Presidential Candidate, and editorship of African Americans in Georgia, a reflection of politics and policy, reflection in the New South. She has published numerous articles and book chapters that have appeared in the Journal of African American Studies, Political Psychology, Presidential Studies Quarterly, Journal of Black Studies, and Social Science Quarterly. Prior to her named professorship at Emory University, Dow had a distinguished career at the University of Arkansas, where she was recognized for her commitments to diversity and students with numerous awards, including the Arkansas Greek Life's Order of Omega Faculty of the Year Award. Raised in Georgia, Dow is a graduate of Savannah State University and holds an MA in political science from Georgia Southern University and a PhD in political science from Howard University. Our second speaker is Dr. Lori Frazier, an associate professor of political science and African American studies at the University of California, Los Angeles. She serves as department vice chair for graduate studies in political science, as well as acting director of the Ralph J. Bunche Center for African American Studies. Her research interests include racial ethnic political behavior, African American politics, women in politics, immigrant political incorporation, and state and local politics. In 2015, she became the first African American female and the first woman of color to earn tenure and promotion in the political science department at UCLA. Her book, Racial and Ethnic Politics in American Suburbs, is the 2016 winner of 2 National Book Awards by the American Political Science Association, including the Best Book About Race Relations in the United States from the Race, Ethnicity, and Politics section, and the Dennis Judd Best Book Award in Urban and Local Politics. She examines international and domestic migration to American suburbs and the responsiveness of state and local institutions to the political and policy concerns of immigrant and ethnic minority groups. Since 2008, she has served as co-principal investigator of the Collaborative Multiracial Post-Election Survey, CMPS, the first multiracial, ethnic, multilingual post-election study of political preferences behavior among registered voters in the United States. CMPS queried more than 105 people in pardon me, that number is not correct. CMPS has queried people in 5 languages: English, Spanish, Chinese, Korean, and Vietnamese. And the 2020 CMPS will survey more than 20,000 adults as a youth sample aged 16 to 17. Kanisha N. Grant, associate professor at Howard University, has research interests including American political parties, American political development, and subnational politics. Her first book, The Great Migration and the Democratic Party, Black Voters and the Realignment of American Politics in the 20th Century, describes how Black migration to northern cities reshaped those political environments. Kanisha has a passion for education and politics that was born out of her early experiences growing up in South Florida. Raised by a single mother, Kanisha quickly learned that getting an education is an incredible part of the political process and would be keys to a better life for herself and her community. A first-generation college graduate, Kanisha earned a bachelor's in political science and a master's in public administration at Florida A&M University. While completing her PhD at Syracuse University's program in public administration, she also served as an assistant to the Civil Rights Commission of the United States. Our final presenter today is Dr. Todd Shaw, a distinguished associate professor at the University of South Carolina, who has been the chair of political science and is the associate director of African American Studies. His 2009 Duke University Press book, Now is the Time: Detroit Black Politics and Grassroots Activism, explores the political, sociological, and ideological ramifications of changes in the post-civil rights movement African American community. Specifically, he is very interested in how class, gender, age, and other social factors create differing definitions of what constitutes African American group interests, and how groups of African Americans and their allies have acted upon these perceived interests. His ongoing project with Dr. Kirk Foster from USC and Dr. Barbara Combs from University of Mississippi explores how and whether African American group identity is becoming distant from neighborhood attachments, and what would such a development mean relative to investments in social capital and local political participation in the city of Atlanta and elsewhere. He also is a co-author of a textbook entitled Uneven Roads: Introduction to U.S. Racial and Ethnic Politics. He is, in addition to having been a past president of the National Conference of Black Political Scientists, also has been a member of the Executive Council of the Southern Political Science Association. Please join me in welcoming all of our esteemed presenters today. And we will begin with Dr. Ford Dow.
Good afternoon. My most recent research is focusing on how we understand Black women's political ambition. And so I am pushing back against what our literature says, because we are missing a key component of why and how Black women engage, and it is community. And so my research is answering the question, how they engage, but what I am finding is that many of the Black women that I have talked to across the country, they are very deliberate about their commitment to community and how they work through and in community. And so that leads me to my talk today, my brief talk today about Black women, and with this idea of strolling to the polls. This is a picture that posted just a few days ago, and it literally broke the internet. It actually received national attention. It was discussed on The View, I believe it was yesterday. And it's a picture of Black women who are members of historically Black sororities, Alpha Kappa Alpha, Delta Sigma Theta, Zeta Phi Beta, and Sigma Gamma Rho. And they're in their colors, they're in their pearls and pumps, and they also have on their shirts, "Stroll to the polls." And so I thought that was a great picture to show, to kind of speak to what I'm going to talk about today, particularly Black women in this moment, organizing through within the community and through their organizations. This picture is very powerful because when we look at these organizations, particularly just these four, we're talking about organizations that have over 800,000 members worldwide and actually over 3,000 chapters worldwide. Next slide. So my research has shown that with Black women in political engagement, what we see is that Black women function and engage with a collective purpose through collective action. Historically, we have seen this with the Black Women's Club movement. We see this with environmental justice issues in Michigan. We saw this with movement and organization around Flint. And then also prior to Flint in Detroit, we saw Black women in the suburbs of Detroit organizing around exorbitant bills when it came to accessing water. So they had very extremely high water bills in the suburbs of Detroit. So we see even around environmental justice, these women are organizing. And we see many other examples historically and even now of how Black women attempt to address issues. It is together in a collective. Also, Black women have a significant amount of social capital within their communities. They have respect and they are expected to do. In some of the interviews I conducted, one of the groups that I conducted, there are 3 women that recently were elected to city council in Reynoldsburg, Ohio. And they had a relationship with each other. They were football moms. Their sons played football. They knew each other through all these different activities that they were doing, and they were known within their communities. And so when they decided to run for office, one decided first and she pulled the other ones in. But they had a connection, not just only with what they were doing with the community, but just their relationships that they had with Black women and other people that gave them a name recognition that allowed them to move forward and be successful in winning elections. Also, one of the things that we're constantly hearing this term that Black women are the backbone of the Democratic Party. And that is true, but I think when we say that, we have to be clear that we're not just talking about voting. Black women, they are the strongest and most consistent voting bloc in the Democratic Party. And my colleague, Dr. Frazier, is going to talk about that in a few minutes. But what we see is that it's also the organizing. Their strength really is in not just only their individual vote, but what they do within the community to get others to vote, as well as educate about civic engagement in politics. And the Democratic Party has become extremely dependent on this labor. When we teach about Black politics and Black political engagement, we have talked about Black candidates working and running outside of the Democratic Party, meaning that they have tapped into resources within the community without the Democratic Party support. Well, now what we're seeing is that Democratic Party has become dependent on this work. Just a few weeks ago, the DNC chair, Tom Perez, was on Meet the Press, and he was discussing the Republican Party strategy of litigating against absentee ballots and other issues concerning the election. He was asked, what was the Democrats' response going to be? Were they going to also pursue a strategy of litigation? His response was that the Democratic Party had an apparatus of people that were mobilized to respond. He never said that they were going to sue, but that he was dependent on this group of people that were going to be in response. So I want to talk about who he was talking about and who the party is dependent on right now. Next. It's Black women. So just a few weeks ago over the summer, prior to Senator Harris being named as VP choice, there was this call for Win with Black Women, in which Black women were arguing that the choice needed to be a Black woman, and that Black women had been laboring, and that this was a moment that that labor had to be recognized. And that labor, as I said, doesn't just include voting, it is the organizing. And so we have women such as Latasha Brown with her organization Black Voter Matters, Stacey Abrams with Fair Fight, and then Melanie Campbell with Black Women's Roundtable, which is a part of the National Coalition of Black Civic Participation. And these women and these organizations, and there are others like these, but these are the most prominent in the sense that what they are doing is that they work beyond the election day. They are tilling the ground in which they are doing voter education. They are providing resources to communities about public policy implementation, voter protection. And so they are working year round. And so that when we get to a general election, it is really just, they are actually just amping up what they have continually done consistently over the years. Next slide. So I just want to get back to the Divine Nine here. One of the other areas that we see Black women organizing is in how they're mobilizing their members. Just a few weeks ago, actually it was 2 weeks ago, the OWN network has a major campaign around voting, and particularly mobilizing Black women, Own Your Vote. And they hosted a program that was co-sponsored with NCOBPS and other organizations. And in that program, many of you may have watched that program, the leaders of the Divine Nine, as well as Links Incorporated and the National Council of Negro Women, all were on, and they were talking about the work that their organizations were doing to get out the vote, but also to protect the vote. And so some of the key things that they were doing that was across all the organizations were that they were mobilizing members to be poll workers. They were encouraging members who were attorneys to volunteer to be poll monitors, and they were partnering with larger organizations to do work, particularly around voter education and voter protection. Next slide. And so the organizations that they are partnering with includes When We All Vote, the Campus Vote Project, Election Protection, the NAACP, and Rock the Vote. And so these groups are really, as what Tom Perez talked about, this is the apparatus. This is the labor that the Democratic Party will be dependent upon on the day of the election. Next slide. So in closing, when we talk about these women and their organizations, their power in action, what we see prior to the election is that they are critical in providing voter education for their members and for the community. And they're doing an amazing job of doing this, even within a pandemic. Voter registration, we have many of the due dates for voter registration are this week. And so you will see on social media, a lot of these organizations have pushed a lot about voter registration in many of these states. Voter mobilization, encouraging people to vote, but also educating people. There's been a lot of push around informing people of how to correctly fill out an absentee ballot, making sure that they follow the deadlines. So a lot of voter education of members as well as community. And then on the election day, they are going to be critical. They will be doing the on-the-ground reporting. So while the NAACP, LDF, and ACLU and others will be filing the lawsuits, they will be the persons that will be reporting when there are incidents that are attempted to prevent people from voting. Also, the poll workers. As we know, with this pandemic, a significant number of poll workers tend to be seniors. And so these women and through their organizations have sought to fill the gap to ensure that polling stations are well staffed, so that will allow for people to actually have their vote counted that day. Also, supporting legal efforts. Many of these women are professional women that are in the legal profession, so they will also be actively engaged in many of the litigation that we can expect to come following Election Day. And so I'm going to stop there, and I'm looking forward to having a conversation about what we see with these women and the impact that they are having and will have in a few weeks. Thank you.
We'll now have Dr. Frazier.
Do we have the full screen? Okay, hopefully you can see the full screen. If you just go to full screen. Yep. Okay, I'm hoping that you can. Yep, there you go. Awesome. Can everyone hear me okay? Can I get a thumbs up, Pearl, if you can hear me okay? Wonderful. All right. So thank you for allowing me to join this amazing group of scholars. I'm reading a little bit from my notes here. Thank you to NCOBPS and APSA for organizing this town hall. I joined NCOBPS, I must say, at the age of 19 as an undergraduate. So all undergraduates out there, get you a good community like NCOBPS, which has been so wonderful at inspiring me and encouraging me to earn a PhD. I wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for the care and the uplift of folks who have been encouraging me since the age of 19. I stand on the shoulders of many giants, including Black women and other women of color in political science, who have been advancing the scholarship and goals of today's presentation. The goals of today's presentation is to examine the intersections of gender, race, and ethnicity in order to understand the extent to which a partisan gender gap in American elections is really representative of all women, and to understand the implications of the partisan gender gap narrative for Black women as we seek to protect all women at the ballot box in just a few weeks. But in the 55th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, 100th year of suffrage, and so much loss and pain that we've experienced as a result of the pandemic, we know that Black women during this time will come out to vote, and we know that we enjoyed Pearl's presentation about how the apparatus gets done, how the work gets done. And we know that Black women have historically been the most vulnerable to voter suppression and violence at the polls. But they turn out anyhow. We want to better understand the implications of the partisan gender gap narrative around the weight of the global pandemic, the fight for Black justice, Black dignity, Black humanity. And so I come to you here to say that in the days leading up to the election and thereafter, it's time to beef up this communication about an uncomfortable conversation around gender, race, and party politics. We need to have this conversation in academia as well as in our homes. Next slide. The 2016 election results reinforced the long-standing presence of the gender gap, which is the difference between men and women in support of the leading or the winning candidate. In 2016, again, it showed overall stronger support among women voters for the Democratic Party candidate in 2016. In 2016, women supported Clinton over Trump by 54 to 42%, hence the 12-point margin for women in favor of Clinton. In contrast, for men in 2016, men favored Trump over Clinton at 53 to 41%. Again, a 12-point point margin for men. Next slide, please. But imagine if we didn't treat all women the same. Imagine if we looked at the gender gap, the partisan gender gap narrative across race and gender. White women, with the exception of 1964 and 1996, have consistently been supporters of the Republican Party presidential candidate since the American National Election Studies began collecting this data in 1948. Next slide, please. However, when you add the vote choice of Black women and Latinas, we see that the partisan gender gap between male and female voters is actually driven by the historical patterns of women of color voters, particularly Black voters, and particularly Black women voters, in majority support of the Democratic Party candidates since the 1960s. So as Pearl noted, these tropes, the backbone of the Democratic Party, the stalwarts of the Democratic Party, the party's most reliable voters. Thank you, Black women, which is what Doug Jones and many others said after the Alabama win. And after 2016, many Black women began to push back against these tropes and demand politics and policy spaces that included their voices, but also candidates that represented them. So we're very proud of the nomination of Senator Harris, which is historic and very hard fought. But it also raises feelings of not just pride, but also fear and anxiety, not just for the safety of Senator Harris, given racism and sexism that many women, particularly Black women, have long experienced, but also concerns about protecting Black women canvassers, protecting Black women poll workers, and protecting Black women voters. Next slide, please. This data from the Collaborative Multiracial Post-Election Survey also includes that of Asian voters, Asian women voters, which is often or too often left out of the mix, which shows you just the spread and also includes third-party vote choice. Now I want to contrast this slide, next slide please, with candidate evaluations for a little bit more context. It's not that Black women were incredibly in love or overwhelmingly in love with the Democratic Party candidate. In fact, they voted for Clinton at 93%. However, they only favored her at 80%, similar to other women of color. Next slide, please. And in fact, disaggregating between various women across race and gender also shows that for Black women, there's quite a considerable spread with regards to Black women's ideology. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to look just for a moment before we get to the implications to race and the partisan gender gap beyond 2016. Next slide, please. In 2017's US Senate race, this was shortly after the number of demonstrations after the inauguration around the country. We saw, in fact, a continuation of the gender gap narrative, but once it's disaggregated by race and gender, we see a different trend emerge. Black women supported Doug Jones at 98%. White women supported Moore at 63%. College-educated women still supported the Republican Party candidate at 52%. Next slide, please. In the Georgia gubernatorial race, we also see a race and gender gap, right? Or more like the gender gap is a race gap. White women supported Kemp at 75% over Abrams at 25%. Black women supported Abrams at 97% over Kemp at 2%, right? And for those of you, just a moment, Sekou, for those of you who think that this is just a Southern thing, if you check out Virginia and New Jersey, you also see that the gender gap is a race gap, where white women supported Gillespie in Virginia at 51%, and white women supported the Republican Party candidate at 53% over the Democratic Party candidate in New Jersey as well. Next slide, please. Now, looking at our most recent election in 2018, we do see that white women split their vote more evenly in this most recent House race at 49-49. And white women have moved towards the Democratic Party since 2016 and since the last off-election year of 2014. And in fact, 59% of white college-educated women voted for the Democratic Party candidate in 2018. Next slide, please. But we also see that in the 2018 House vote, Black women remained the largest Democratic Party supporters, followed by Latinx women who continue to shift to the Democratic Party in greater numbers. So the partisan gender gap in 2018 continues to lean Democrat due to large numbers of women of color voters. Next slide, please. So I'll conclude with a few implications. White women consistently behave differently from women of color, particularly Black women and their vote choice. Most existing studies of gender differences on vote choice, particularly before the 2016 election, have consistently been undifferentiated by race and gender and have not included large samples of different racial and ethnic groups. That it gives us the ability to look at vote choice across gender and race and ethnicity. If we fail to look at both race and gender, we can never fully understand differences among women, and we'll continue to treat all women as a monolith, and they are not. The voices across geography, the heightened attention to the suburban voter as though women of color do not live in many cases in the majorities of American suburbs, the majorities of metropolitan areas that many women of color live in suburbs of those metropolitan areas. And also we won't fully understand other social demographics like sexuality and other pressing public policy concerns. Next and final slide, please. So I also want to invite you to view an article that I wrote in 2018, which tried to uncover and help us understand the role of sexism and racism in the 2016 election, which continues to unpack why we see some of these trends emerge between women across race and gender. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Frazier. We'll now hear from Dr. Grant.
I want to talk to you about demography and party strategy. In some ways, we've been talking to you about this the whole time as we think about women and the vote, but I want to think about this in a different direction as well. And the first question I have as we think about this is, why are American presidential candidates interested in securing the Black vote? And so I just want to kind of think about and talk about some of the things that we might know in our minds and know in conversation with other people, but that we don't talk about in the literature as often. So I think that there are two things that we need to consider. I consider these things in my book, The Great Migration and the Democratic Party, and in a related article in the Du Bois Review about how this relates to national politics. But I think Black migration is critically important to American politics. And I think that for the purpose of this conversation today, it's important to remember that presidential candidates want to win the Electoral College. And when you think about presidential candidates and their desire to win the Electoral College, they often start by thinking about the large Electoral College delegations. Although sometimes they think about the smaller ones as well, they often think about the large ones, and they think about the ones that have the capacity or the likelihood of swinging to their side as opposed to the other side. And so we hear lots about battleground states, we hear lots about swing states. When we think about the large Electoral College delegations, for the purpose of this talk, I'm thinking or talking about those states that have 15 or more delegates or 15 or more votes in the Electoral College. And these are the states that represent those numbers. We're talking about California, we're talking about Michigan, Ohio, Florida, New York, North Carolina, and so on. When we think about these places that have these large Electoral College delegations, we might also think about places that also have Black populations. And so again, the question is, why are they, presidential candidates, so worried about the Black vote? And I think the answer has to do with both the Electoral College and Black migration. And so when you look to see where Black people live and where they have lived historically, the same states are the states where there are large Electoral College delegations and large populations of Black people. Some of these states are states that presidential candidates have cared about since the Great Migration, which was a movement of Black people from the South, outside the South, to many places in the North and in the Midwest and the West between 1915 and 1970. Black people are moving again, which has more ramifications for American politics. And they're moving from those places where they went in the Great Migration and returning to the South. And you see here that there is notes, or there are notes about where people used to live or where they went in the Great Migration: New York, Chicago, Detroit, Los Angeles, and that folks are going back to the South to places like Atlanta, Charlotte, Houston. Folks are interested in Washington, D.C., although we have issues with gentrification here, so that makes it a little bit more difficult to see. And I think that these changes in migration, this return migration pattern, creates new possibilities for American politics. So I don't think that we get an Andrew Gillum or a Stacey Abrams as the candidate that represents the Democratic Party in Florida or in Georgia without the changes that come from return migration. And I don't think they get as close as they do to winning, or I might say even actually winning and having it stolen from them, without this return migration to the South. Return migration matters not just for those gubernatorial campaigns or for state and local campaigns, but also for approaches to strategy in 2020 and beyond. Some of the places that we think about as important to presidential candidates in the 2020 election are important also in the story of return migration. I'm thinking here about Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, for example. And so I'd say finally that return migration is another thing. This demographic location of Black people is another thing that helps us think about how the party behaves. And if you think about how Kamala Harris, Senator Harris, gets her nomination to the Democratic ticket as its vice president, which I'm clearly excited about, I think that we have to think about demographics too, not necessarily thinking about Chicago here, but also thinking about the fact that she is a Black woman and the fact that Black women live in those states in large numbers, and Black women expect that the Democratic Party should be responsive to their demands to have folks in office and folks on the ticket who look like them. And so I'll stop there and look forward to entertaining any questions that you all might have about demographics as we do our Q&A.
And we'll now have Dr. Shaw.
Okay. Thank you very much. And it's a great pleasure to join this panel. And I'm Todd Shaw again. And we have a tradition of NCOBPS of talking about being among the family of NCOBPS. So it's a great pleasure to be among friends and family. At this time, I'm just going to say a few words about other dimensions of the gender gap. My fellow panelists have said some brilliant things with regards to one dimension of gender, but I want to bring in other dimensions of gender with regards to the question of the Black male problem, the quote unquote Black male problem. I'm putting quotes around that, and the Black vote. And I'm showing you two pictures here that I think represent the continuum or the aspects of the continuum of power in Black politics. On the left side of your screen is Representative David Bowen, who is a state representative in Milwaukee. And he talked about how Joe Biden could win conceivably with a slightly smaller margin of African-American men voting than true of African-American women. But there is a important dynamic we know in this election of the need for, given all of the barriers to be confronted, that there is a fundamental need for every vote to be counted and every vote to be harnessed. And then on the left side is 24-year-old Mr. Kenny Pascal, who in an interview with the New York Times said he wanted to vote, he would vote, and thinks he might be missing out on something. But he is facing the prospect of not being permitted to vote because of the felony conviction laws within his state. And so the continuum from state representative to young man who seeks to vote, but is nabbed in this structure of systemic racism that confront Black women and men. So I think I wanted to just sort of say my comments relative to a fact that has been much discussed and I'm drawing upon your comments to think a little bit more about comments I might put into writing. And that fact is that if you take a look at some of the validated voter surveys or possibly exit polls, that they revealed 14% of Black men said they voted for candidate Trump in 2016. And of course, this is interesting, but as you've seen from our previous presenters, this is in context with the fact that within the African-American community and African-American women, so overwhelmingly voted for the Democratic candidate. And if you look across this data I got from Pew relative to all other sort of race, gender intersections, that Black men next to Black women are the least likely to vote for candidate Trump. Now, Rashawn Ray, who is at the Brookings Institute, would pull this apart by saying, at least from his analysis, those Black male Trump voters were more highly educated, conservative, and religious. And so they had some of the same traits, if you will, that ideologically might fall along the lines of those who are voting for Trump more broadly. Thanks to the 2016 CMPS, and I'm gonna give a shout out to someone who I was her teacher in college, but she's now my mentor, which is Lori Frazier, and her co-authors, or excuse me, our co-principal investigators with the CMPS. We have this wonderful data. And so I'm looking at just sort of two questions, of which have already been referenced. One is in the election of president, who would you vote for? And I show you sort of the margins for Black men and Black women, which are overwhelming margins for Hillary Clinton. But whereas Black women, there's a 9% difference of more Black women voting for Hillary Clinton. Much smaller numbers as reported in validated surveys in this survey of Black men and women voting for candidate Trump, although Black men outnumber Black women 2-to-1 in that small margin. Likewise, with those favorability ratings that Dr. Frazier has already referenced, Hillary Clinton, 78% of African-American women had a favorable or somewhat or very favorable view of Hillary Clinton. Similarly, Black men, very high levels at 71%, which was about a 7% difference rounded up, but with candidate Trump, 10% of Black women and 17% of Black men, again, that represented that difference of about a negative 7.1 points when you subtract the Black men's rate for Black women's rate. So there is this sense that African-American women, both in their policy progressivism and in the progressivism of their vote, there is a margin of difference between them and their African-American male counterparts. And as Laurie has also referenced, this is not, you really can't get at this ideologically. You have to look at these intersections of race, gender, and the ways in which African-American men and women, I would suggest, plug into various social networks that inspire and mobilize their organization, their leadership, their vote. And so it's not just a matter that ideologically you can sort this out, because there aren't these sort of whopping differences, again, CMPS data would say between African-American men and women who self-identify as liberal, moderate, or conservative. Again, this is just another cut at previous discussions with Dr. Dow and Dr. Frazier. And so we look at this overall question of the gender gap between men and women voters, and we see the gender gap from the standpoint of turnout, that there are sort of, at least going back to Reagan and Carter, you had sort of, or actually to the Reagan-Mondale race of '84, you had a higher percentage and then a persistently higher percentage of women turning out as compared to their male counterparts. This, however, gap, again, as referenced previously, is larger among African-American women and men. And you can see essentially these lines work in tandem. And we see this period, of course, in the 2000s, the 21st century, of this line of turnout going up for both groups. And so we should think about both this question of African-American men and women's standpoint, but how being connected to a community in some ways brings about sort of a similar connections within institutions, even given that African-American women participate at higher levels across the board, and particularly within voting. I also sort of just pulled some data from that related to college students and the tough university studies across universities, college students. And when we compare 2012 to 2016 presidential turnout, we see these increases across all groups, but we saw this sort of 5% difference in turnout among younger African-Americans or African-American college students, which mirrored what was true of African-Americans, if you go back to my previous slide, or think about the previous slide, which mirrored that downturn in turnout from 2016 to 2012 among African-Americans overall. Let's keep in mind, however, that still even in 2016, you still had a large average turnout for African-Americans, even given that downturn. And so if you take 2016 and compare it to the 1990s, you have a very different picture than if you compared it just as a 21st century phenomenon. And then we also, one thing I sort of pose to our thinking is 2020 like, is 2020 going to be like 2018 or like 2016? The 2016, the downturn in African-American turnout for the reasons that we will unpack later, versus 2018, whereas 2018 as a midterm election, as you all know very well, saw sort of this record increase across the board. I mean, you have to go back to 1914 in order to have the similar rate of a midterm turnout 104 years ago, to have the same level of turnout that you saw in this blue wave of 2018. And again, looking at this data as related to college students, you saw these sort of increases or upticks among African-American men and African-American women with regards to the percentage turnout. And even given that you saw sort of Latinx women having the higher rates, African-American women who were college students were not far behind, and African-American men clearly had doubled their rate from 2014 to 2018. And what will be the sort of driver, if you will, even given again, the ways in which African-American women, young and across the board, are turning out in higher rates. Now, I won't get far into this because I want to not do that professor thing and go over time. But I will just sort of reference, because I know there's actually brilliant minds on this, all on this panel and in the audience whose work speak directly to this, whether it be this question of the carceral state and questions of carceral citizenship, and the ways in which this has a gendered aspect to it. You know, I'm just sort of briefly referencing the work of Uggins, Ryan, and Shannon, of the 6.1 million Americans who are forbidden to vote because of felony disenfranchisement. We know how this directly impacts African Americans. The imprisonment rate for African American women being twice their white female counterparts, and almost 3 times for men, given their black men for their black or their white male counterparts. We know what's happening in Florida, with even given the passage of the amendment that had some restoration of the franchise to formerly incarcerated individuals. We know the court rulings that have halted that process because of the stipulation of having to pay court and other fees that created economic barriers. We also know of efforts going on in terms of voter purges across the states, and particularly in states like Ohio, that have had court sanction, and the gendered way this may have an impact, particularly when you have African-American men having higher rates at which they don't consistently vote across elections, and thus may be susceptible to purges. And then I'm going to argue that a direct appeal to the needs of African-American men and women and African-American communities can also have a suppressive effect on the vote, and particularly of African-American men in the dimension of the talk I'm highlighting here. Again, I'm referencing Rashawn Ray's work from the Brookings Institute that talks about the sort of the particular economic segregation and discrimination African-American men confront, and in what ways does this show up in the economic disadvantages that have an impact upon political mobilization. Drug arrests and drug prosecution being higher, but the ways in which the economic disadvantage of being involved in and being capitalized in the hemp industry is the other end of the continuum that faces African-American men in particular, but African-American communities and women in particular as well. I'm gonna jump forward a bit, but I will say very briefly, there's a Center for American Progress a research piece that I'll just briefly reference here, in saying that the 2012 rates of turnout were similar to, the 2016 rates were similar to 2012 rates, the long and short of it would be candidate Clinton would have won that election. And these battleground states that they made these simulations and these calculations in convey that set of predictions. So let me just conclude by saying that around this question of mobilization, there is this sort of discussion about the mobilization of black male, of the black male vote, of the Black Male Voter Project, and Amplify Action are just two among other organizations trying to get at this question of black male voters. I want to raise the question very similar as a parallel to Dr. Frazier's question of the critical way in which we do not ask this as a zero-sum game. The ways in which you sort of mobilize the black male vote as though it is in a separate question for African-American women, given the social networks, community networks, family networks that individuals find themselves, and of course the sexism as a layered aspect upon which African-American women confront, particularly in this election and particularly within their individual lives. And then what are the interests and these that will be mobilized? And are there particular interests that are the when and where I enter interests? Are there ways in which we can make an argument that if you understand these interests that directly confront African-American women, you see the broader interest of a community? And that's not to say it doesn't speak to African-American men's interest, but they are not not in diametric opposition to each other. And so I want to broaden that question of mobilization as an important parallel to what African-American men and African-American women confront. Thank you.
Well, before we get started with our Q&A, I wanted to do two things, points of order. First, to welcome Dr. Wendy Smooth, my co-moderator, and then to give everyone an opportunity to just congratulate and thank our presenters. Thank you so much for these incredibly important and thoughtful research presentations. All of your findings have been so illuminating, and we have a number of really pressing questions to get through right away. So I'm gonna just go ahead and clap for them. And thank you all for doing that work. All right. So I will start with the first question that I can see in the chat. Please feel free to post your questions in the Q&A as opposed to in the chat. So it's just a little bit easier for Dr. Smooth and myself to be able to read them and see them in one place.
Tiffany, if we could, as we're going through and scrolling through the amazing questions that we definitely want people to continue to put into the chat, perhaps we ask a broad question for the panelists overall to engage that I think also captures some of the early questions that have gone into the Q&A and into the chat. And that's really about us thinking about the 2020 election. You all have done such a magnificent job in terms of thinking about the importance of the intersection of race and gender. As a scholar in that area, I can't say how much my heart is warmed to see so much growing scholarship in this area. But in particular, we also want to contextualize, as the panel title talks about, we are thinking about voter turnout in the midst of a pandemic. Right? And you all have talked us through mobilization incentives, and you also have talked us through historic mobilization on the part of organizations. You've talked to us about key battleground states that we need to pay attention to. But what happens in the midst of a pandemic where we're thinking about voter turnout? Can you talk about the significance of the backdrop of the pandemic for all of the kinds of mobilizations that we've been talking about, and for in particular talking about the various groups, in particular gender groups that we are uplifting in terms of what the pandemic means for Black voter turnout and Black gender dynamics? Thank you.
I'll jump in on that. Just from what I have seen and looking at how these organizations are mobilizing, I think that the issue of the pandemic really, I think, centered what these organizations were saying around voter education and having a plan And I think that plan really is around voter, respond to voter suppression, but having people really think consciously about their decision. How are they going to do this? And so I think Black voters have for months thought about, how am I going to do this? I want to vote. Am I mailing in a ballot? And I think a lot of people initially went that direction over the last few weeks. Some people have not. We've seen, and I believe it was in Philadelphia, where there were actually plannings where people actually turn in their ballots so they could vote in person, because they were concerned about the efforts in the Pennsylvania legislature to pretty much tamper with vote counting. And so I think it has made people more deliberate in the decisions. I think there is some concern, particularly around older voters. So when we're talking about Black women and turnout, a lot of those voters are our elders. So I think we have to now be at a phase now where people have not submitted absentee ballot. How do we get these voters safely to the poll and get them back home? So I think that has to be the second part of this phase. I haven't seen that yet. Maybe some of you have, but I'm hoping to see that those are some conversations about the people who are going to show up. But I think we are encouraged. Just this week, the early voting began in South Carolina, and to see the lines of people that were spaced out. They were people masked, but they were standing in line wrapped around those buildings. So I think people are committed to showing up. But I think the second phase of this now has to be those that are showing up. How do we get them there safely, and inform them of ways to get them safe if they have not done the absentee ballot process?
Todd, you're getting in there.
Yes, thank you. So I'm curious as to when we think about this as an aspect of African-American political history, there's much work we can draw upon this in that regard. But I'm wondering about the ways in which the current pandemic is having an impact upon African-American social networks, and as we use that word, social capital, right? And so what does it mean for African-American churches to have to meet on the church parking lot in order to have services, or do it over Facebook and the internet? Or for African-American, we often talk about African-American barbershops and beauty shops and salons, sort of these important social places of social discourse. Again, referencing work I know that of individuals who are in the audience. But thinking about the ways in which there is this sort of public discourse that has always been integral to African American, thinking, mobilization, social norms. In what ways is it taking place? And so I'm wondering, is social media or the adaptations to these spaces enough? And are we going to see? I think there are ways in which we're spending more time at home, so we're plugged in ways we haven't. Very anecdotally, my 88-year-old, she would have gotten on me from saying her age, but my mother is now connected on the internet in ways she wouldn't have been. And so, yes, she can connect to her church in other ways, but at the same time, is it the same? And so that's one concern I have as to those factors that may help to mobilize. Are they there?
Lori, is that your?
Sure. Well, I want to echo, let me make sure my mic is on. I want to echo Pearl and Todd, because we do have a long historical context of grassroots organizing, get out the vote, GOTV forms of mobilization. And the Black church has been front and center of that, as well as this kinds of civic organizations, the Divine Nine and others that Pearl notes. I really worry about the impact of the pandemic on African Americans, especially our elders and those more seasoned voters. I also worry about the distrust among Black voters in the mail-in process, the extent to which their vote will count if they do not take that journey towards the polls with packing a lunch and bringing a yard chair to sit out and engage in their civic duty. And it is a part of the ethos of the Black experience to engage in that day. I worry about Black women canvassers, Black women poll workers and their safety, particularly in light of the stand back and stand by. I wondered about the extent to which our secretaries of state and our county registrars are vigilant and aware of some of these fears of both distrust among Black voters, but also in terms of protecting poll workers and canvassers. I truly believe that Black women will show up and show out like they always do, but that still doesn't mean that it didn't give me pause to hear Trump make those claims or make that statement about stand back and stand by. And I wonder about the extent to which it affected Black women somehow differently when we think about verbal or either other acts of violence that we know about through our history, through narrative, through the sharing of stories among our elders and others who've taught us and had us learn the ways of what we've been through in order to gain freedom and the access to the vote. One quick thing that I wanted to say about, and this has been noted in the questions and in the comments, is the extent to which voter turnout surpassed whites in 2012, and Black women's voter turnout surpassed that of any other racial and ethnic group in 2008 and 2012. And then the 7% drop in voter turnout, everybody went crazy about the extent to which, you know, Black folks, particularly Black women, didn't show up in the ways that they should have. But as Ishmael White and Cheryl Laird and so many others have pointed out, we really do need to look and compare to Black voter turnout in 2008, because in fact, in 2016, Black voter turnout went right back to the same rates as they did in 2004. So we have to instead look at the cycles of undermobilization for Black voters. So rather than preparing the narrative around blaming Black voters, the 18 to 34 who may or may not be as enthusiastic, and our elders who are afraid or have mistrust in the political process, the mobilization needs to happen right now for those groups to make sure that they understand how to get things done. It's not whether or not they want to do it or whether or not they have agency, but making sure that they feel secure in the process. And again, comparing back to 2004, we should learn some lessons about the stakes of undermobilization of the Black electorate.
Can I say something real quick, Lori? So I participated in a poll workers training last week, and it was the Black women that were raising the question of security, particularly with the opportunity for people to actually observe, like what were the guidelines about observation, who actually can come in. So it was the Black women that I noticed that were really adamant and pushed the trainer to really commit to, you know, where's the security? Will the police be, you know, going around the polls? So that is something that I think those of us who have volunteered to do that is conscious. But as to your point, it's not that we don't have the commitment, it's just we are very conscious of our safety. But we also, I think, to what my earlier point was about the community piece, we're there because we're concerned about the community. And so that's part of the mindset of Black women, is why we're doing what we're doing, is that it is the community that I may be in harm's way, but I want to ensure that my grandmother, my aunt, uncles, that they can have the right to vote too.
Thank you. Kanisha?
Something Dr. Fraser said reminded me of a question in the Q&A, which is about whether Black institutions have changed as return migration happens. And so I think that it's really critically important to continue to say out loud to Democrats, anybody else that will listen, that you have to actually campaign to Black people, that we have Black girl magic, but we're not actually magic. That is a phrase that we use to celebrate ourselves. And so I think that to answer the question about whether the organizations and the social networks in the Midwest and in the North have changed, and whether that changes the way we do politics, I think it's a both and. I think we know that one of the things that happened in the Great Migration was that as people moved, it was also the case that their movement changed the nature of churches, changed the nature of access to medical care, changed the nature of their civic organizations. And so I would imagine, I'm not finished studying yet, but I would imagine that the same thing is happening in these Midwestern places, where as people move, they take that social capital with them. But I want to say again that I don't think it's just that I think it's important for Democrats to campaign to Black people if they expect that Black people will come out, and not to assume that it's a thing that happens automatically.
Excellent. Tiffany, did you want to take one of the questions from the Q&A?
Yeah, I did actually. So there's a question, and I'm not going in proper order because we've actually addressed some of the chat questions and some of the Q&A questions. And I know that there's a couple of people, Dr. McCormick and Dr. Penderhughes, that also have questions, but I'm going to go with this one from Tiana Massapoy. Thank you so much for your time and research. Do we see any implications from Breonna Taylor, the lack of justice and the issue of protecting Black womanhood on the election and swinging any potential moderates regardless of race? I think that's a really important question. I'd love to hear, a couple of the folks respond to that one.
I think I'll start because mine will be a bit more general than I assume the folks who are thinking about gender will be. I think that this outcome is important insofar as it reminds us of George Floyd. And so I don't know about y'all's world, but it seems like things happen so fast that the George Floyd protests were so long ago. And so I think that these things that happen, in particular, the feedback we get from Breonna Taylor's case, is just a reminder of how we felt in that moment. And I think that those reminders will be important to move people, particularly white moderates who might be interested to move, to do so when they get these reminders about her case, when they get these reminders about standing back and standing by and all of those other things. I think have a piece of them that cringe. And I think some of them might be willing to move on the basis of not wanting to be associated with racists, even if that means that that's just a decision that they make between themselves and their ballot once they're in the ballot box.
Thank you so much for that. So another question, I want to actually give a space to Dr. McCormick. I know you've had a comment that you've had your hand up for a really long time. If you'll unmute yourself, then we can hear your comment.
Tiffany, I believe we
Dr. McCormick should be able to talk now.
Oh, okay.
All right. Dr. McCormick, if you unmute yourself, we should be able to hear your question or your comment.
Can you hear me now?
Yes. Go right ahead.
Since I'm the relic in this group, I am still working through this Zoom technology, but I just wanted to compliment you for the outstanding work that has been done. This is just a huge leap forward in terms of electoral research that we've seen over the past 30 years, and I can't wait until the post-election analysis, which I think is going to be very much informed by what we've seen today. Again, thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. McCormick. Go ahead, Wendy.
So again, thank you. This is, I wanted to echo the importance and significance of this level and caliber of work as well. I wanted to move to an additional question that seems to exist in the Q&A in various forms. And it's a question about the relatability of Senator Harris, particularly for African-American men, if we're thinking about the ways in which African-American male voters will be mobilized, whether or not the record as a prosecutor and DA has any impact in terms of connection, building connection with African-American male voters in particular, or depressing that voter turnout and support among African-American men. And Todd, we'll start with you and we'll move around the Hollywood squares here.
Okay, thank you. So I think actually this question relates directly to the previous question about Breonna Taylor. And I'm thinking of the interesting sort of historical moment of candidate Harris being on the debate stage as a former prosecutor and now U.S. Senator and now the vice presidential candidate who's sort of certainly broken a particular barrier. And but speaking to the moment of Breonna Taylor and that question about Breonna Taylor. And I think it was intriguing that the question was framed about the lack of justice to Breonna Taylor, of which Harris responded and certainly tried to project in a record as a progressive prosecutor. I think this is a broader question around the whole say her name campaign, among many others that Professor Crenshaw and many others have mobilized around to raise these questions. And I've been thinking likewise about this question about how these incidences of the state and police violence against Black women have shown up in our public consciousness and our mobilization in different and sometimes very different ways than confront what we see among the state violence against Black men. Having said this, I do think that that we're in this extraordinary moment where I'm not quite certain of the earlier concerns around candidate Harris's prosecutorial record are now the fundamental issue. And that might redound to, that might be a downside in terms of the narrowing of Black politics because we're in such a moment around consensus. I do think it is a question, it's a fair question to actually ask what was her record and what did she pursue? And I say this, in an attempt at my scholarly objectivity, although I'm a son of Howard University and proud of her candidacy in other respects. But I do think there is an empirical question to ask, and how do we think she has been able to address that more squarely? Because I have done some research to ask that same set of questions. And I'm not absolutely certain that question is resolved, particularly among African-American men who may raise that. And are they raising it because of the concern around her criminal justice, her record as a prosecutor? Is it some vestige of sexism? Is it both? And so I'm not certain that we've resolved it, and we won't know, of course, until about Thanksgiving when all this is settled. But at the same time, I think it's a multi-pronged question, and one that I think goes to the heart of the gendered nature of Black politics.
So any other panelists want to add to that? Because we also see this question also coming up in relationship to the broader conversation around the ways in which Biden's response in the first debate around law and order and justice, and the ways in which the scholars around the panel may have read that as an inappropriate kind of connection between law and order and race. So thinking about what that means for both Black voters overall, but then also these kinds of gender dynamics that we see within the Black vote. So maybe think about this in terms of broader BLM organizing, thinking about this in regards to the kind of BLM and other Black mobilizations, direct action protests, and this kind of idea of law and order. So that's something, a few questions brought together.
I'll go. I'm waiting. I'm like, Pearl, do you have your hand on the you go ahead. You go ahead.
Oh, well, I mean, it's a deep question because to what Todd said, there are multiple layers here. And I think one of the things, particularly with the Biden, that initial response, and then juxtapose it with what he said a few days ago in his speech, I think it still speaks to this strategy of trying to find and attract these white voters who are gone and they ain't never coming back. And the Democrats they won't accept it. They won't accept that. These folks have been gone for over 25, 30 years. They are gone for a reason. right? And so I think when we see those moments, you see a party that is still struggling to accept who they are and who their voters want them to be. And so I think that is to the identity problem that white Democrats have, because Black people are really clear about this is what we believe and what we expect of this party. But I think from a research standpoint, this is a great opportunity to reinvent or revigorate the field around political socialization, which has been dormant for a very long time. I think we have to talk about the fact that when we're talking about Black men and even young Black people who are questioning Harris, we're talking about Black people that are not tied to a party in the way that people in my age are. They were not socialized around party politics in the way that we were. The media, all these different ways that they're being socialized. So I think there's a lot here to look at, and we have an opportunity to what Dr. McCormick spoke to really shift our field and shift political science and how we understand how people are coming to politics. But I think when we look at these Biden, but back to my point, when we look at these Biden here, I think we're still seeing that remnants, even though we want to see the party move towards us. Those comments are saying that they are still slow to do that. And hopefully, you know, like Todd, I'm a daughter of Howard, and I'm excited about Kamala. Hopefully by Thanksgiving, we can see that maybe that didn't hurt the party. But it's something that they're still reckoning with. And unfortunately, it's like, come on, hurry up and let's get there, because this is where, if you want to win, you've got to move and you've got to let those folks go.
Lori.
As I noted in my opening comments, how we stand on so many, the shoulders of so many giants in the study of Black politics, particularly Black women who've been for the last 25 years or more. Wendy Smoove and others have been pushing us to position the interests of Black women and to be able to look at the data across race and gender. And that's been a really long, hard fight. But I wonder about the extent to which the Democratic Party cares much about Black men or the discipline of political science, because you'd be hard pressed to find a comprehensive study in one of our premier journals positioning the interests of Black men. I also would like to know more about this 14% of Black men who favored Trump in 2016 and the extent to which public policy issues like immigration, like employment and education, and law and order, broadly defined, right? Weaponized even as in terms of its language, but the extent to which Trump's overtures to the Black community and partnerships with folks around incarceration and the carceral state has had an impact. And what do we lose as a discipline if we don't try to understand the impact of these policy initiatives, whether they're overtures or something that has an impact? That's an empirical question on the Black male electorate. And I also wonder about the extent to which they themselves feel it. They themselves feel alienated from the process. So, you know, these are just questions that I raise. And Todd, I just want to say to you, my mentor, that I appreciate your presentation and I appreciate the conversations that we've had. And I hope that these conversations will continue unapologetically, because Black women and Black men, we can often get, when we begin to have these conversations, as defensive as white women are, when we question the extent to which the loyalty to the Republican Party and then Black women's loyalty to the Democratic Party. So these kinds of conversations are difficult to have, but they're worthy. We're worthy to have and engage within our own communities and across communities. So I guess I'm just raising more points than answering them, but we'd be hard pressed, and we can do better as a discipline if you want to answer these questions before the election cycle to try to understand the large percentages of Black men, not just for Trump, but ask somebody 60 and over in your family if they voted for Reagan and Bush #1, right? And you might be surprised about the answer that's not talked about in Thanksgiving or Christmas.
and to your point, and not talked about in our data, and the ways in which we collect and ask and formulate the questions, which is why it's so critically important around the work that you're leading to help us ask our questions differently. One thing I want to uplift, there have been several questions and inquiries about the slides and whether or not they will be posted. More to come in that regard. We want to make sure that we are protecting the intellectual property of these amazing scholars, but we will also further in knowledge building and knowledge production. So those slides will, we're working towards getting those slides available to you, but we will also be working towards making sure they are appropriately copywritten. We want an opportunity to continue, so you all continue to place questions in the Q&A. I think we could probably, Tiffany, get one additional question in before we close it out. We have certainly rattled many corners, including calling into question what is our role as an academic discipline, which are questions that we certainly appreciate for how we grow the discipline and the relevance of political science overall. And certainly a huge research trajectory coming out of just this webinar alone. Tiffany, I turn it to you.
Thank you, Wendy. There's a question from Diane Pinderhughes. Dr. Pinderhughes wrote, voting in a pandemic, but there's also the question of campaigning in a pandemic. Maya Wiley declaring her candidacy for New York City mayor today, and I thought, wow, she's got to campaign. And then she also listed her announcement there. So thoughts that any of you all have about what it means to actually be campaigning at this moment?
Pearl, I'm going to look to your work on political ambition, because I do know that, you know, oftentimes the shortcomings of Black women being able to run a successful campaign means that they need donors and they need the capacity to run and run well. And some of the differences between women of color running versus white men running for election. And you know, this was news to me, Diane, that you shared about Maya Wiley. And I'm wondering that, you know, within this pandemic space where we're utilizing a virtual space more readily, will it hurt or harm in terms of some of the shortcomings of running a successful electoral campaign around fundraising, around you know, getting out the name recognition. And again, this is uncharted territory, not just at the presidential level, but at state and local races, about the impact that this medium is going to have on Black women and women of color seeking elective office. So again, this is an uncharted terrain. But I do know that the question for me is the extent to which this space and fundraising and kinds of other things that are so pivotal to being successful, how will these candidates, women of color, parse this space of campaigning and fundraising? Will it help or will it harm? And I don't have the answer to that. Maybe Pearl and Wendy, you might have more to say.
I don't have the answer to that, but I will say the fundraising piece is quite interesting. So I interviewed over 25 Black women from across the country, all the way from Alaska, Maine, Michigan, all throughout the South, various levels, school board in California. The amount of money, and we oftentimes talk about the congressional races. When I'm talking, I had talked to some women that ran for a local city council, and they were raising $50,000, $60,000, and these are in small little suburban towns. And so to Lori's point, when we talk about fundraising, what is needed for these women to win a school board position or a city council position, when we get to the state level. And what these women were really clear about was that they understood the rules were very different for them. They talked about working rooms with white women, and they knew that the same white person that was going to give them $300 was going to give this other person $500. So they were very conscious of that. But I think one of the things that the research also shows, and Wendy has researched, is Black women are extremely strategic, right? And so I think that we're going to see some very innovative ways that Black women are going to find to come together to fundraise. One of the things I mentioned, the Reynoldsburg women, they ran as a slate. And that was just amazing to me how they came together to pool their resources in this white suburb in Ohio to win. And so I think we're going to see a lot of strategies around when these women announce. That's also very important that these women talked about. When they announce was important because they knew that when they announced that a Black woman's going to run, here comes, trying to get a bunch of Black men to run against them. That was also a strategy that they were acknowledging was happening in some of these communities. So I think we're going to see just amazing strategies from women and just new ways. And I think Black women are going to lead the way in how women overall begin to look at some of these issues. And then I'm encouraged because even with name recognition, I'm thinking about in Florida with Val Demings. She raised so much money last quarter, she gave money back. She gave money to the DNC, to the DCC. So you have these women that have this major fundraising chops that we don't talk about. So hopefully, to your point, Laura, it is going to be a problem, but hopefully Black women being Black women will find ways to overcome in this moment.
So we are amazingly up against time, but what a generative conversation, what an engaging set of research questions. I wanted to plug 2 additional places where this conversation can continue. One, every spring, and we have already announced this spring we will be virtual, the National Conference of Black Political Scientists host an annual meeting where these questions are at the center of multiple days of conversation that spill into the hallways and spill into the byways, but we will figure out how to do that all virtually. And you too can experience the scholarly family that Todd Shaw referenced as one of our former presidents. I also want to plug that the proposal portal is open now for the American Political Science Association, another space for this conversation to continue. The theme is around pluralism, and one of the NCOBPS members, Valeria Sinclair Chapman, is one of the what do we call ourselves? Co-host of the program, chairs. Sorry, my mind went off for a moment. So those are wonderful opportunities for us all to continue the conversation. For those of you who are teaching this semester, we hope that you will bring this conversation and others around the importance of race and gender and other elements of identity into our conversations on voting. I want to again thank the presidents of these organizations, NCOBPS and APSA, who excitedly joined in to the proposition by a group of Black women political scientists who were fired up about what our voices as political scientists would mean to the election cycle. So let's keep these conversations going. Let's teach, let's research, and let's keep each other encouraged in the days ahead. Thank you all, and look out for the recording, the availability of the recording and the slides. Join us all again. Help me thank my amazing co-moderator, Tiffany Willoughby-Harrod, President-elect of NCOBPS, and all of our amazing panelists. Thank you so much for your time. Everyone have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you.